few weeks ago, there were reports that the United States and Iran had agreed in principle to have direct bilateral talks. This hasn't happened since the founding of the Islamic Republic in 1979. Now, both sides denied that, but they would, of course, in the run-up to the election. Now we're going to find out if that's true. Iran is still being reticent about that officially. When the reports initially came out, the foreign minister, Ali Akbar Saleh, denied them outright. Now the head of the judiciary, Sadiq Larijani, is saying they won't happen overnight. He's condemning the sanctions, but we're going to find out. With Israel, things are also interesting because the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, came close to endorsing Mitt Romney, or certainly perceived that way, and then of course his horse lost. And this week there was an awkward and delicious press conference that Netanyahu called, where he publicly congratulated Obama. He called in the American ambassador because he's in a bit of a tight spot as well. For Israelis, their relationship with the United States is their number one security foundation. And a lot of Israelis feel that Benjamin Netanyahu has jeopardized that by his perceived favoritism towards Mitt Romney, and he's facing re-election in the new year as well.
It was a pretty bad week. The best a kind of an intergovernmental affairs minister can hope for is that no one sort of notices he's there. But in this case, with those questions about his campaign spending hanging over his head, people have suddenly had reason to focus on him. And the problem for Peter Penashue in this situation is that when you focus on him, you realize it's not clear why we have an intergovernmental affairs minister. And those questions are pretty uncomfortable for any minister, and it really is a serious question that needs to be asked, above and beyond sort of the fun the opposition was having with him this week. It really isn't quite clear why this government maintains that portfolio. Any kind of the major ministers are able to function with on their own dealing with the provinces, and the Prime Minister sort of is his own intergovernmental affairs minister. So this is sort of a question that even if he can explain the election spending next week when he is supposed to explain himself, this question of why he's there and why this job is there is going to linger until, at least until the next cabinet shuffle.
I think so for a couple of reasons. First is our Prime Minister was in the world's largest democracy this week, and the largest story to come out of that trip, or at least the one that got the most play in Ottawa, was his choice of car, or the choice of car that was selected for him as he drove through parts of that country. Meanwhile, there were a couple of very important things he was talking about: nuclear trade being, with India being one, and something else being the concerns, whether they're legitimate or not, about rising Sikh extremism in Canada. The reason that newspapers maybe didn't give that the front page coverage it might otherwise have received was because, of course, the re-election of U.S. President Barack Obama. But that maybe wasn't the most concerning part about our distraction by the American election. Maybe the most concerning part was that everyone was so much more excited, it seemed, by this election than by our own elections. I was invited to more U.S. election parties than I was Canadian election parties in 2011. Maybe I've made more friends, or maybe it's the bubble I live in, and people are just really pumped up about watching Americans elect their leaders. But if we had nearly the excitement here when we elected our leaders that they had down there, and that we had for them, sort of on their behalf, while they elected and re-elected their president, I think it would do a lot for at least morale in our democracy.
Quite a lot, actually. I spent some time the last few days down at the National Gallery of Canada, where they have a big show of recent Canadian contemporary art acquisitions, a wonderful show. And this comes after the gallery has made some steps in the last few months, last year really, to broaden their reach to other parts of Canada. Notably, earlier in the fall, they announced a 3-year partnership with the Art Gallery of Alberta. And then you go to the other big ones, which would be the news we had last month from the Museum of Civilization. It's going to be rebranded as the Canadian Museum of History, and they're getting $25 million for a facelift to go along with the new name, which is significant at a time of restraint. And the last of the big three would be the National Arts Centre, which has just announced that it's bringing 250 performers from the Northern Territories, Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and the Yukon, into town in the spring. And I think that it's not a coincidence that they're doing that at a time when the Prime Minister has continued to make the far north a kind of focal point for symbolism of Canadian pride and patriotism. So it's interesting. Supposedly days of austerity, you might think the arts institutions would be feeling the pinch, but instead we see a kind of expansionist, quite buoyant mood among them. And I think it's worth keeping in mind that they've been able to do this at a time when other federal agencies and institutions have been feeling constrained.